Inspector Lestrade removed his gloves in the entrance hall of St. Cuthbert's Abbey, the leather damp from an afternoon that couldn't decide between mist and rain. The stone beneath his boots was older than any building in London, worn smooth by centuries of sandaled feet, and it held a particular kind of cold, the deep, patient cold of places built to outlast the men who built them. The air carried traces of incense, not fresh, but lingering, as though the morning's devotions had stained the very atmosphere. And beneath that, another scent. Beeswax candles, stone dust, and something he associated with age. Parchment, perhaps, or simply time itself. He folded the gloves carefully, tucking them into his coat pocket, and allowed himself a slow breath. The silence here was not restful. It pressed against the ears like a physical thing, demanding to be noticed. He had expected quiet, of course. Monasteries were meant to be quiet. But this was different. This was the silence of a place holding its breath, waiting for something it dreaded to name. The wrong detail sat in his mind like a stone in his boot, impossible to ignore. A man found crushed beneath a bell rope, neck broken, evidence of struggle in the positioning of the body and the abraded skin on his palms. Yet, not a single soul in the Abbey had heard the bells ring that night. Lestrade was not a fanciful man. He had worked London's streets long enough to know that most mysteries dissolved under the application of patience, procedure, and a willingness to ask uncomfortable questions. But this particular puzzle had resisted his usual methods with the quiet stubbornness of a door that would not yield to ordinary keys. The entrance hall stretched before him, dim despite the daylight outside. High windows of ancient glass, greenish, uneven, thick as a man's thumb, filtered the afternoon into something softer, something almost underwater. The walls were bare stone, punctuated at intervals by iron sconces holding candles that had burned down to stubs. A wooden bench, its surface polished by generations of waiting, stood against one wall. Above it hung a simple cross, dark wood on darker stone. Brother Timothy, the monk who had met him at the gate, stood nearby with the posture of a man accustomed to being unobtrusive. He was perhaps 50, with a fringe of grey hair circling a tonsured crown, and hands that showed the calluses of manual labour, garden work, Lestrade guessed, or perhaps the heavier tasks of maintaining a place this old. He had not spoken since leading Lestrade inside, and he did not speak now, merely waited with the infinite patience of those whose lives moved to the rhythm of bells rather than clocks. The body was discovered at prime, Lestrade said, breaking the silence gently. It was not quite a question, but it invited confirmation. Yes, Inspector. Brother Timothy's voice was soft, measured, as though he had trained himself never to disturb the quiet more than necessary. Brother Anselm went to ring the bells for morning prayer, and found Brother Clement. Lestrade drew out his notebook, a gesture of habit more than immediate need. The details were already written there, transcribed from the telegram that had reached Scotland Yard 2 days prior, and from his own preliminary interviews that morning. But the act of consulting the notebook gave people time to gather themselves, and it gave him time to observe. At what hour is prime? 6 o'clock, Inspector. Before dawn, this time of year? And Brother Clement was found in the bell tower, beneath the rope. Yes. A hesitation, barely perceptible. The rope for the largest bell, the one that rings the hour. Lestrade made a note he did not need to make, letting the scratch of pencil on paper fill the space. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the ancient glass in its leading. The sound seemed very far away. "I'll need to see the tower," he said. Brother Timothy nodded and turned, his robes whispering against the stone. Lestrade followed, his footsteps louder than he would have liked in the vast hush of the corridor. They moved through the abbey like travellers through a monument to patience. The corridors were narrow, the ceilings vaulted and ribbed, the walls lined with alcoves that might once have held statues, but now stood empty, testament to reformations and dissolutions long past. Lestrade found himself aware of the weight above him, stone upon stone, the accumulated mass of faith and labour spanning back to a time when this place had been new, when the men who laid these stones had believed they were building for eternity. It was, he thought, a good place for secrets, a place where silence was not merely expected, but enforced by rule, where men trained themselves to notice inwardly rather than outwardly, where the discipline of the hours, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline, created a rhythm that left little room for the unexpected. And yet something unexpected had occurred. They passed a door that stood ajar, revealing a glimpse of the chapel beyond. Rows of wooden choir stalls, a simple altar, more candles. The smell of incense was stronger here, mixed with the particular mustiness of old vestments and older stone. Lestrade caught sight of a few monks at prayer, their heads bowed, their lips moving in silent devotion. None looked up as he passed. "How many men live here, Brother Timothy?" he asked, keeping his voice low. 23, Inspector, including the abbot. "And all were accounted for the night Brother Clement died?" "Yes, Inspector. We keep to the night office. Matins at midnight, lauds at 3. All were present. All returned to their cells afterward. Save Brother Clement." A pause. "Save Brother Clement." They reached a door, bound with iron, set into the base of what Lestrade knew must be the bell tower. Brother Timothy produced a large key from somewhere within his robes and fitted it to the lock. The mechanism turned with the smooth resistance of something well maintained, and the door swung inward on hinges that did not creak. Beyond lay a spiral stair, rising into shadow. "I'll wait here, if I may, Inspector," Brother Timothy said quietly. Lestrade nodded and stepped through. The stair was narrow enough that his shoulders nearly brushed the walls on either side. The stone was worn in the centre of each step, hollowed by the passage of feet over centuries. No windows pierced the tower's walls at this level, and the darkness thickened as he climbed, relieved only by the faint daylight filtering down from above. He counted steps out of habit: 32, 33, 34, and emerged into the bell chamber breathing only slightly harder than usual. The space was larger than he had expected, perhaps 12 feet across, with a ceiling that rose into the pointed arch of the tower's peak. 4 bells hung in their frame, massive shapes of bronze and iron, their surfaces patterned with age and weather. The largest was perhaps 5 feet in diameter, its clapper thick as a man's arm, and beneath it, coiled on the wooden floor like a sleeping serpent, was the rope. Lestrade approached slowly, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The rope was hemp, thick and strong, darkened with age and the oils of countless hands. It descended from the bell's mechanism through a hole in the floor above, designed to allow it to hang down into the ringing chamber, where a monk could pull it to sound the hours. This morning, 2 mornings ago now, Brother Anselm had found Brother Clement here, lying partially beneath this rope, his neck at an angle that left no doubt about the cause of death. The body had been removed, of course, taken to the Abbey's small infirmary, and then to the village for examination by the local physician, who had confirmed what Lestrade's own eyes had seen. A broken neck, consistent with a fall or a blow, bruising on the throat suggesting pressure from the rope itself, abraded palms indicating the victim had gripped something tightly in his final moments. What the physician could not explain, what no one could explain, was the silence. Lestrade crouched beside the rope, examining it in the pale light from the tower's single window. The fibres were intact, showing no signs of fraying or recent damage. He ran his fingers along its length, feeling the texture, the slight stiffness, from exposure to weather. His hand came away clean. No blood, no obvious trace of violence. But there was something. He shifted position, angling his hand to catch the light, and saw it. Fine particles clinging to his skin, almost invisible, unless you knew to look for them. Metallic dust, or something very like it. He rubbed his fingers together, feeling the faint grittiness, and looked more closely at the rope. There, embedded in the fibres, visible only because the light struck them at just the right angle, were tiny metallic fragments, as though the rope had been in contact with something made of metal. Not the bell itself, which was bronze, and would leave a different trace, but something smaller, something sharp enough to abrade the fibres. He stood, brushing his hands clean, and moved to examine the bell. The great bronze surface was dark with age, its tone deepened by decades of weather and ringing. He walked around it slowly, looking for he knew not what. Damage, displacement, anything that might explain why this bell, which had rung the hours faithfully for generations, had remained silent on the night a man died beneath its rope. And then he saw the wax. It was subtle, barely visible against the dark metal, but once noticed, it was unmistakable. Small drips and deposits of wax on the bell's clapper, the heavy metal tongue that struck the bell's interior to produce sound. The wax had melted and run, then hardened again, creating a coating that would muffle the clapper's impact, deadening the sound. Lestrade straightened slowly, his mind working through the implications. Someone had silenced the bell deliberately. Someone had climbed this tower with wax and applied it carefully to the clapper, ensuring that when the rope was pulled, whether in struggle or in the ordinary ringing of the hours, the bell would not sound. But why? The Abbey had its legend, of course. Brother Timothy had mentioned it that morning, his voice careful, and his eyes troubled. The bells that fell silent before death, the old story that stretched back generations, of bells that refused to ring when God himself had marked a man for judgment. It was superstition, the kind of tale that accumulated around old places like moss on stone, but the monks believed it, or enough of them believed it to make the silence that night seem like prophecy rather than crime. Which was, Lestrade realized, precisely the point. If the bell had rung during the struggle, someone would have come running. The silence had bought the killer time, time to arrange the body, time to leave the tower unseen, time to let the scene become something ambiguous, something that could be interpreted as accident or divine intervention rather than murder. He stood in the bell chamber as the afternoon light shifted, painting new shadows across the ancient bronze, and felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders. This was not a simple matter of London violence, a theft gone wrong or a domestic dispute turned fatal. This was something more calculated, more patient. This was a crime that had used the Abbey's own rhythms and beliefs against it, and it would require, he thought, a particular kind of attention to unravel. Lestrade descended the spiral stair more slowly than he had climbed it, his mind already composing the telegram he would send. The Yard had procedures for this sort of thing, requests for consultation, formal channels, proper documentation. But Lestrade had learned over the years that procedures were tools, not masters, and that some cases required less orthodox approaches. Brother Timothy waited at the base of the tower, patient as stone. "Inspector, have you found anything?" Lestrade chose his words carefully. "I've found questions, Brother Timothy. Good questions, where he is always the first step." The monk's expression flickered with something that might have been hope, or might have been dread. The two were not so different when dealing with mysteries that touched the divine. "Will you be staying, then, to investigate?" "For now," Lestrade said. "But I think this matter may benefit from a particular set of eyes. There's a consultant in London whom I've found useful in unusual circumstances." He did not say the name. There was no need, and besides, the telegram was not yet sent. But as Brother Timothy led him back through the corridors toward the abbot's quarters, where he might write in privacy, Lestrade felt a small measure of relief. Some puzzles were meant for plodding patience, for the steady accumulation of facts and witnesses. Others required something more. An ability to see not just what was there, but what was deliberately absent, what had been carefully arranged to look like something other than what it was. The Abbey of Silent Bells, Lestrade thought, had been waiting for someone to hear what its silence was really saying. He would send the telegram before evening prayers, so the telegram reached Baker Street during that peculiar London hour when afternoon had exhausted itself, but evening had not yet properly begun. The city existed in a state of suspension, gas lamps beginning to bloom against the gathering dusk, while shop windows still held the last amber wash of daylight. Hansoms clattered through streets that smelled of coal smoke and damp wool, of roasting chestnuts from corner braziers, and the perpetual underlayer of Thames mud that no amount of progress could quite eliminate. Sherlock Holmes stood at the window of 221B, watching the lamplighter make his methodical way down the street, each lamp blooming to life with the regularity of a heartbeat. Behind him, the fire crackled in the grate, casting shifting patterns across the cluttered sitting room. Books piled on every surface, chemical apparatus gleaming on the side table, newspapers folded and refolded until their creases had become permanent scars in the paper. Mrs. Hudson's knock was brisk and businesslike, the knock of a woman who had long ago ceased to be surprised by anything that occurred in her lodgings. "Telegram for you, Mr. Holmes," she said, handing over the envelope with the air of one delivering something that was both expected and potentially troublesome. Holmes took it, without turning from the window, his long fingers breaking the seal with absent precision. His eyes moved across the text once, twice, and then a third time, with the focused intensity Watson had learned to recognize as genuine interest. "Watson," he said, still watching the street below, "how do you feel about the countryside?" Dr. John Watson looked up from his chair, where he had been attempting to read the evening paper, despite the way its pages insisted on catching the firelight and throwing shadows across the text. the countryside, in November. Monasteries specifically, old ones, the sort with legends attached. Watson folded his paper with the resignation of a man accustomed to sudden departures. "I feel," he said carefully, "that I should probably pack a warm coat." Holmes turned then, and Watson saw the slight smile that indicated a problem worth solving. Lestrade has found himself in possession of a locked room that isn't locked, a murder that looks like an accident, and a prophecy that came true by remaining silent. That's remarkably cryptic, even for Lestrade, isn't it? Holmes crossed to his desk and began composing a reply with quick, precise movements. A monk found dead beneath a bell rope in a tower accessible by a single stairway, yet no one heard the bells ring. The Abbey has a legend about bells that fall silent before death. Lestrade, sensibly, suspects human agency rather than divine intervention, but he's stuck on the mechanism. Watson rose, already mentally cataloguing what he would need. "When do we leave?" "There's a train at 7:15. We should be at St. Cuthbert's Abbey before midnight." Holmes finished his telegram and held it out. "Would you mind taking this down to the boy? Tell him it's urgent." Watson accepted the telegram, glancing at the text. "Arriving late train stop. Preserve bell tower." Precisely as is stop touch nothing, stop Holmes. "You think there's evidence still there?" "I think," Holmes said, reaching for his coat, "that what's absent can be as revealing as what's present. And Lestrade is clever enough to know when he's looking at a stage rather than a scene." The train carved through the darkness with the relentless rhythm of progress, its whistle echoing across fields that had known centuries of slower travel. Watson sat by the window, watching England transform as they moved away from London's gravitational pull. The urban sprawl thinned and fractured, giving way to villages that appeared as clusters of light against the black countryside, then to isolated farmhouses where single lamps burned in kitchen windows, and finally to darkness punctuated only by the train's own reflection in glass and water. Holmes sat opposite, apparently absorbed in a 3-day-old newspaper he had extracted from his coat pocket. But Watson knew better. The newspaper was a prop, something to occupy his hands, while his mind worked through the problem Lestrade had presented. Every few minutes his eyes would lose focus, staring through the paper at some internal landscape of logic and deduction. "Tell me about monasteries, Watson," Holmes said suddenly, lowering the paper. "You've read more medieval history than I have." Watson considered. "You want the romantic version or the practical one? The one that helps me understand why men choose silence as a discipline." "Ah." Watson shifted in his seat, gathering his thoughts. "Well, the monastic tradition is built on the idea that silence creates space. Space for contemplation, for prayer, for hearing what the noise of the world drowns out. The rule of Saint Benedict, which most English monasteries follow, emphasizes quiet as a tool for spiritual development. Speech is permitted but governed. Unnecessary talk is discouraged. So silence becomes both practice and culture." Exactly. And in a place like St. Cuthbert's, which has apparently been operating for centuries, that culture would be deeply embedded. The men there would be accustomed to communicating in other ways. Gestures, scheduled activities, the rhythm of the bells themselves. Holmes nodded slowly, which makes the bell's silence that night particularly significant. Not just the absence of sound, but the absence of a language everyone understands. "You think it was deliberate, then? not accident or divine intervention. Lestrade thinks so, and Lestrade has good instincts despite his limitations. Holmes tapped the newspaper thoughtfully. A man doesn't die beneath a bell rope without that rope being pulled, and a bell rope doesn't get pulled without the bell sounding, unless someone has taken specific action to prevent it. The question is not whether it was deliberate, but why that particular method was chosen. The train swayed through a curve, and the lights of another village appeared in the distance, scattered like spilled embers across the dark landscape. There's also the matter of access, Holmes continued. A single stairway, watch during the prayer offices, a tower that serves a specific function in the Abbey's routine. Someone would have needed both opportunity and knowledge of that routine to commit murder there without being seen. An inside job, then? Almost certainly, which presents its own complications. Holmes folded the newspaper with precise creases. Religious communities are peculiar social structures, Watson. They combine the intimacy of family with the hierarchy of military organization. Everyone knows everyone else's habits, but questioning anyone challenges the bonds of trust that make communal life possible. Lestrade will have found that people are willing to talk, but reluctant to accuse. Watson thought about that as the train carried them deeper into the countryside. The monasteries he had read about were places of profound discipline, where men surrendered individual will to collective purpose. But they were also human places, subject to human failings, jealousy, ambition, desperation. The vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience might constrain behavior, but they did not eliminate the passions that drove it. "What's your theory?" he asked. Holmes smiled. "I make it a point never to theorize before I have data. Theories are like scaffolding, useful for construction, but they obscure the building itself. We'll see what the Abbey shows us." They arrived at the village of St. Cuthbert just before midnight, the train depositing them at a tiny station that seemed to exist more as an afterthought than a destination. The platform was empty, save for a single lantern hanging from a post, its light swaying in the wind that swept down from the hills. A carriage waited in the station yard, its driver a local man who nodded recognition when Holmes gave the Abbey's name. "Inspector Lestrade sent word you were coming," he said, helping them load their bags. "Queer business up at the Abbey, sirs. Very queer." The drive took them through darkness so complete that Watson felt as though they were travelling through the space between stars. The carriage lamps illuminated only a narrow corridor of road, revealing hedgerows and stone walls that appeared suddenly, and then vanished just as quickly. Occasionally, far off across the fields, he could see the faint glow of a farmhouse window, small and warm and impossibly distant. And then, rising against the marginally lighter darkness of the sky, he saw the Abbey. It stood on a low hill, its silhouette medieval and massive, a complex of buildings dominated by the square tower of the church, the whole surrounded by walls that had been built to last centuries. Light showed in a few windows, golden and wavering, candlelight or lamplight, filtered through ancient glass. The carriage passed through an arched gateway in the outer wall and entered a courtyard paved with stones that rang beneath the horses' hooves. The driver pulled up before a heavy wooden door bound with iron, and almost immediately it opened, revealing Inspector Lestrade in his travelling coat, looking tired but alert. "Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for coming so quickly." Holmes descended from the carriage with the fluid grace that characterized all his movements. "Your telegram suggested urgency. Has something changed?" "Only that the abbot is growing anxious about scandal, and the monks are beginning to elaborate the legend." Lestrade led them inside, into an entrance hall that Watson recognized from countless engravings. High vaulted ceiling, bare stone walls, the smell of age and incense. Half of them are convinced it was divine judgment. The other half are too frightened to say what they think. "And you?" Holmes asked. Lestrade's smile was weary. "I think someone is very clever and very patient, and I think they're counting on the Abbey's own beliefs to obscure what they've done." They moved through corridors that seemed to absorb sound, their footsteps muffled by the sheer mass of stone around them. Watson found himself struck by the weight of the place, not oppressive exactly, but present, undeniable. This was a building that had stood through wars and reformations, through centuries of prayer and labour, and it wore that history in every worn step, every smoke-darkened beam. Lestrade had arranged rooms for them in the Abbey's guest quarters, small cells with narrow beds and simple furnishings, utterly unlike the comfortable chaos of Baker Street. But they were clean and quiet, and the silence that settled over the Abbey as the night deepened was profound. Watson lay awake for some time, listening to that silence, wondering what it meant to live inside it day after day, year after year. Somewhere in the darkness, bells would ring for matins, the midnight office, calling the monks to prayer. He meant to stay awake to hear them, to get some sense of how they sounded, but the exhaustion of travel pulled him down into sleep before the hour came. If the bells rang, he did not hear them. Morning arrived with the pale, tentative light particular to November in the countryside, a light that seemed uncertain of its welcome. Watson woke to find Holmes already dressed and standing at the small window of his cell, looking out over the Abbey grounds. "Sleep well?" Holmes asked without turning. "Well enough. You?" "I never sleep well in new places. Too many unfamiliar sounds." He gestured toward the window. "Come look at this." Watson joined him, peering out at the view. The Abbey was larger than he had realized, a complex of interconnected buildings arranged around several courtyards. Directly below their window was a cloister garden, its beds dormant for winter, but still showing the geometry of careful cultivation. Beyond that rose the church with its distinctive tower, and beyond that he could see other structures, dormitories, workshops, perhaps a library, or scriptorium. "The bell tower," Holmes said, pointing. "You see how it's positioned?" Watson studied it. The tower was square and solid, built of the same dark stone as the rest of the Abbey, with narrow windows near the top where the bells would hang. It rose from one corner of the church, accessible, he assumed, both from inside the church itself and via some external stair. "I see a tower," he said. "You see a watchtower. That's what it was originally. Norman construction, probably 11th century. The bells came later, but the tower was built to observe, to see across the valley in all directions, which means it's isolated, commanding, and, most importantly, it has limited access points, making it easier to control who comes and goes." Precisely. This wasn't a crime of opportunity, Watson. This was a crime of careful planning. Holmes turned from the window. "Lestrade is meeting us for breakfast in the refectory. He wants us to interview the abbot before we examine the tower." They found Lestrade in a small dining room set aside for guests, where a monk had laid out simple fare: bread, cheese, apples, and small beer. The monk himself said nothing, merely bowed and withdrew, leaving them in the same profound silence that seemed to permeate every corner of the abbey. "Brother Timothy," Lestrade explained, keeping his voice low. "He's been assigned to assist us. Good man, practical, not given to superstition, but even he seems uneasy." Holmes broke bread thoughtfully. "Tell me about the victim, Brother Clement." Lestrade drew out his notebook. Age 42. Came to the Abbey 5 years ago as a convert. He'd been in secular life before, some sort of clerk or minor gentleman. The records aren't entirely clear. Took his final vows 3 years ago. By all accounts, a quiet man, devoted to his studies. Worked in the library cataloguing manuscripts. Popular? Not unpopular. The other monks describe him as reserved, conscientious, no enemies that anyone will admit to. Which means either he had no enemies, Holmes said, or his enemy was patient enough to hide their hostility behind monastic courtesy. Watson spread cheese on bread, thinking. What about the night he died? Where was he supposed to be? In his cell, like everyone else after Compline. That's the final evening prayer. The monks observe what's called the Great Silence from Compline until after prime the next morning. No talking, no unnecessary movement. Everyone stays in their dormitory wing unless there's an emergency. But Brother Clement wasn't in his cell. No, he was found in the bell tower at dawn, beneath the rope, neck broken. The physician confirmed he'd been dead for several hours, probably died sometime between Compline and Matins. Holmes set down his bread, his eyes growing distant. The hours of deepest silence, when movement would be most noticeable, but also most unexpected. A clever time to commit murder, if you could manage it without being seen. The stairway to the tower, Watson said. Surely someone would have noticed if Brother Clement, or anyone else, had used it during the Great Silence. Lestrade shook his head. That's part of what makes this so damned difficult to unravel. The stairway has 2 access points, one from inside the church, one from the cloister. During the day both are visible, used regularly. But at night, during the Great Silence, no one has any reason to be watching either entrance. The assumption is that everyone is where they're supposed to be. An assumption, Holmes said softly, that the killer understood very well. They finished their meal in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. Through the window, Watson could see monks moving through the cloister, going about their morning tasks with the unhurried purpose of men whose days followed ancient patterns. They moved quietly, communicating when necessary with small gestures or brief words, their robes whispering against the stone paths. It was, Watson thought, a beautiful way to live, ordered, peaceful, dedicated to something larger than individual desire. But it was also fragile, dependent on trust and mutual respect. And someone had shattered that trust with murder. "The abbot is expecting us," Lestrade said, rising. "He'll want assurances that we can solve this quietly, without bringing scandal to the abbey." Holmes stood, brushing crumbs from his coat. "Tell him we'll solve it truthfully. Whether that's quiet or not depends on what the truth turns out to be." They followed Lestrade through more corridors, these ones lined with doors that Watson assumed led to administrative offices and private quarters. Everything was scrupulously clean, maintained with the care of people who understood that their surroundings were not merely functional, but sacred. The abbot's study was a corner room with windows overlooking both the cloister and the valley beyond. Books lined 2 walls, their spines showing the wear of regular consultation. A large desk dominated the space, its surface organized with the precision of a man who valued order. The abbot himself was perhaps 60, with silver hair and the kind of face that had once been handsome and had aged into dignity. He rose as they entered, his expression grave, but welcoming. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for coming to our aid. Inspector Lestrade speaks highly of your abilities." Holmes inclined his head. "Thank you for your hospitality, Father Abbot. I understand this has been a difficult time for your community." "Difficult," the abbot repeated, as though testing the word's adequacy. "Yes, Brother Clement's death has disturbed us deeply. Not only the loss itself, but the manner of it, and the questions it raises." "Questions about the legend," Holmes said. "It was not quite a question." The abbot's expression flickered with something that might have been pain. "The legend of the Silent Bells is old, Mr. Holmes, older than any man now living in this abbey. Whether it's true or not, whether such things can be true, I leave to theologians and philosophers. What I know is that my community is frightened, and that fear is corrosive to faith." "Then let us restore certainty," Holmes said quietly. "With your permission, I'd like to examine the bell tower now, the physical facts first, the human ones after." The abbot nodded slowly. "Brother Timothy will take you. I ask only that you treat this place with respect. Whatever happened here, St. Cuthbert's Abbey remains holy ground." "I understand," Holmes said. And Watson, watching his friend's face, believed that he did. The morning light had strengthened by the time Brother Timothy led them across the cloister toward the bell tower, though the sun remained hidden behind a ceiling of grey cloud that promised rain before nightfall. The cloister garden lay dormant in its winter sleep, the herb beds reduced to skeletal stalks and dark earth, but someone had maintained the paths with careful attention. Not a fallen leaf disturbed the geometric perfection of the stonework. Holmes walked with his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes moving constantly, cataloguing everything. Watson had seen this before, the way his friend seemed to absorb a place through his skin, noting not just what was visible, but what those visible things implied about routines, habits, the invisible architecture of daily life. "The tower serves multiple purposes," Brother Timothy explained, his voice barely above a whisper, despite the open air. "The bells mark our hours of prayer, of course, but they also served, once, as warning. In older times, when raiders came up the valley, the bells would sound the alarm." "How often are they rung now?" Holmes asked. 8 times daily for the 8 offices: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, and compline. Brother Anselm is our sacristan. He oversees the bells and ensures they're properly maintained." Lestrade, walking beside Watson, murmured quietly, "Brother Anselm was the one who found the body. He went up to ring prime and found Brother Clement beneath the rope." They reached the door at the tower's base, the same door Lestrade had entered 2 days before. Brother Timothy produced his key, but Holmes held up a hand. "A moment, if you please." He crouched before the door, examining the threshold, the frame, the ancient iron hinges. His fingers traced the wood grain, testing for scratches or marks that might indicate forced entry. Then he stood and inspected the lock mechanism itself, his face close enough that Watson half expected him to produce his magnifying glass. "Well maintained," Holmes said finally. "The lock is old, but functional, and it shows no signs of tampering. How many keys exist?" "3, Brother Timothy said. "I hold one. Brother Anselm holds another, and the third hangs in the abbot's office for emergencies." "And on the night Brother Clement died, all 3 keys were accounted for?" "Yes, Mr. Holmes. Inspector Lestrade verified this." Holmes nodded, apparently satisfied, and gestured for Brother Timothy to open the door. The spiral stair rose into shadow, just as Lestrade had described. Holmes paused at the threshold, examining the stone steps themselves, then began to climb, with Watson close behind. The stairway was narrow enough that Watson's shoulders nearly brushed both walls, and he found himself counting steps as they ascended, a habit from his military days, knowing always how far one had come, and how far there was still to go. 37 steps brought them to the bell chamber. The space opened around them like a stone flower, circular and surprisingly spacious once one emerged from the claustrophobic spiral. 4 bells hung in their wooden frame, suspended from a massive oak beam that had been hewn when this tower was young. The largest bell dominated the centre, its bronze surface dark with age and weather, its clapper thick as a man's forearm. The 3 smaller bells, for the quarters and special occasions, hung in descending sizes, their curves catching what little light filtered through the narrow windows. And beneath the largest bell, coiled on the wooden floor like a penitent serpent, lay the rope. Holmes stood perfectly still for a long moment, simply observing. Watson had learned to recognize this as a crucial phase of his friend's method, the initial intake, the recording of the scene as a whole before it was disturbed by closer examination. Holmes's eyes moved from bell to rope to floor, to walls to windows, building some internal map that only he could see. Then, with the delicate precision of a surgeon, he began his examination. He started with the rope, crouching beside it without touching, his face close enough to see the individual fibres. Watson watched as Holmes produced a small magnifying glass from his pocket. There it was, and studied a section of the rope with absolute concentration. "Lestrade," Holmes said, not looking up, "you noticed the metal filings?" "I did. I wasn't sure what they meant." "They mean someone wanted to weaken specific sections of the rope without making it obvious. Look here." Holmes indicated a spot about 4 feet from the rope's end. "The fibres have been abraded, not through natural wear, but through deliberate action. Something sharp and metallic was drawn across them repeatedly, creating microscopic cuts that wouldn't be visible to casual inspection, but would significantly weaken the rope's integrity." Watson knelt beside Holmes, peering at the indicated section. Now that it was pointed out, he could see the subtle damage, fibres that looked slightly frayed, catching the light differently than the surrounding rope. "But the rope didn't break," Lestrade observed. "No, because whoever did." This calculated precisely. They wanted the rope to feel normal when used, to hold a man's weight during the initial pull, but to fail at a specific point of stress. Holmes set down his glass and ran his fingers lightly along the rope's length, feeling for other signs of tampering. The question is whether they wanted it to fail during the ringing of the bell or during a struggle. He stood, moving now to examine the bell itself. The massive bronze curve rose above him, its surface inscribed with Latin text worn smooth by centuries of weather. Holmes circled it slowly, his eyes scanning every inch of the metal, and then he stopped. "Watson, bring your medical eye here." Watson joined him, looking where Holmes pointed. There, on the bell's clapper, were the wax deposits Lestrade had found, small drips and accumulations of what appeared to be beeswax, hardened and discoloured with age. Beeswax, Watson confirmed, applied deliberately by the look of it. Someone melted wax and dripped it onto the clapper. For what purpose? Lestrade asked. Holmes reached up. He was just tall enough, and touched the wax gently. To deaden the sound. The clapper strikes the interior of the bell to produce the tone. If you muffle the clapper with a soft material, the impact becomes significantly quieter. With enough wax applied correctly, you could render the bell nearly silent. The implications settled over them like the Abbey's own quiet. Someone silenced the bell before the murder, Watson said slowly. They wanted to ensure that no one would hear it ring during the struggle. Or after, Holmes added. He moved to the window, a narrow opening in the thick stone wall that looked out over the Abbey grounds and the valley beyond. "Tell me about the night Brother Clement died. What was the weather like?" Lestrade consulted his notebook. Cold, clear, no rain, little wind, the sort of night where sound would carry clearly. And yet no one heard anything from this tower. No bells, no shouts, no sounds of struggle. Holmes gazed out at the landscape, his profile sharp against the grey sky. Which means either the killer was extraordinarily lucky, or they understood very well how sound behaves in this space. He turned back to the chamber, his eyes moving to the hole in the floor through which the rope descended. This rope hangs down into the church itself, yes, where the monks would stand to ring the hours. Brother Timothy, who had remained silent during the examination, spoke up. "Yes, Mr. Holmes. The rope passes through to the ringing chamber directly below. During the offices, one of us pulls the rope to sound the bell." "Show me." They descended the spiral stair once more, emerging into the church proper through a small door Watson hadn't noticed before. The interior was dim and cool, the air thick with the accumulated incense of centuries. Wooden choir stalls lined the nave, facing each other across an aisle worn smooth by countless sandaled feet. Above them, visible now that Watson knew to look for it, was the rope descending from the ceiling, from the bell chamber above. Holmes walked to the rope and took hold of it, testing its weight, feeling the texture. During the night offices, who would ring the bell? Brother Anselm, typically, Brother Timothy said. As sacristan, it's his responsibility, though any of us might ring if he were ill or otherwise unable. And on the night Brother Clement died, Brother Anselm rang for Compline, the final evening office. At what hour? 9 o'clock. And the bell sounded normally? Yes, I heard it myself from the dormitory. Holmes released the rope, watching it swing gently. So the wax was applied sometime between 9 o'clock that evening and dawn the next morning. A window of approximately 9 hours, during which everyone was supposed to be observing the great silence, Lestrade added. Quite. Holmes paced the length of the church, his footsteps echoing softly against stone. Let's consider the sequence. Someone, our killer, needs to silence the bell to commit their crime undetected. They must climb the tower stairs, apply wax to the clapper, and return without being seen. This requires knowledge of the Abbey's routines, access to beeswax, and sufficient privacy to accomplish the task. Watson followed the logic. The Abbey keeps bees? Brother Timothy nodded. We do. Brother Osric tends them. He's our youngest novice. We use the wax for candles primarily, though some goes to sealing documents in the library. Where is this wax stored? In the workroom adjacent to the kitchen. It's accessible to anyone in the community. Holmes made a small sound of satisfaction. And the tower itself? You said the stairway has 2 access points. One we just used, one from the cloister. Are both kept locked? The exterior door, yes. The interior door, the one we came through from the church, is typically unlocked during daylight hours, but secured at night, after compline. Secured by whom? Brother Anselm again. He checks all the doors before retiring. Holmes stopped pacing, his eyes distant. So we have a killer who knows the routines, knows when the doors are locked and unlocked, knows where materials are stored, and knows enough about bells to understand how to silence them effectively. This speaks of someone with considerable familiarity with the Abbey. Someone who lives here, Watson said, almost certainly. Holmes returned to the rope, examining the floor around it. The wood was old, scarred with centuries of use, but clean. Someone swept regularly. Brother Timothy, I need you to think carefully. On the night Brother Clement died, during the hours between compline and prime, did you see or hear anything unusual? Anything at all? Even something that seemed insignificant at the time? The monk's brow furrowed. I'm not certain, Mr. Holmes. The great silence is observed strictly. We retire to our cells and remain there until the bell for matins. I heard nothing unusual. What about at matins itself? When you gathered for the midnight office, were all the brothers present? Yes. I remember specifically because I was concerned about Brother Clement. He had seemed distracted at vespers, and I wondered if he was unwell. But he was there at matins, in his usual place. Holmes's head snapped up. Brother Clement was alive at midnight? Yes, certainly. He participated in the office, sang the psalms with us. It was only after we returned to our cells that he must have gone to the tower. A long silence followed this revelation. Lestrade's expression showed that this was new information to him as well. Brother Timothy, Holmes said carefully, when did you last see Brother Clement alive? After matins, we filed out of the church in our usual order, and I saw him walking toward the dormitory wing with the others. That was approximately midnight. And his body was discovered at 6? Yes, at prime, when Brother Anselm went to ring the bell. Holmes turned to Lestrade. Your physician estimated time of death as several hours before discovery. Can we narrow that window? Lestrade flipped through his notes. Between midnight and 4 in the morning, he said. The body had begun to cool, but wasn't yet cold. So Brother Clement died sometime in the deepest part of the night, during the hours when the great silence was most profound and movement most restricted. Holmes began pacing again, his mind clearly working through possibilities. He left the dormitory after matins, or appeared to, and went where? To the tower, to meet someone. Was he lured there, or did he go of his own accord? Watson considered the image, a monk leaving his cell in the dead of night, moving through silent corridors toward a bell tower where death waited. If he went voluntarily, he must have had a reason, something important enough to break the great silence. Or someone he trusted asked him to come, Lestrade suggested. Holmes stopped at the base of the rope, looking up toward the bell chamber far above. The wax on the clapper, the weakened rope fibers, the timing during the great silence, these all speak of premeditation. This was not a crime of passion or sudden violence. This was planned, carefully and patiently. He turned to face them, his expression grave. And that, gentlemen, makes it considerably more dangerous. We're not looking for someone who acted in rage or fear. We're looking for someone who could wait, who could plan, who could manipulate the very fabric of this community to create an opportunity for murder. Through the high windows, the promised rain began to fall, pattering softly against ancient glass. The sound seemed to emphasize the church's profound silence, the weight of stone and faith pressing down around them. "I need to speak with Brother Anselm," Holmes said, "and I need to know more about Brother Clement, what he was working on in the library, who his friends were, whether he had any concerns or fears in the days before his death." Brother Timothy nodded. "I'll arrange it. Though you should know, Mr. Holmes, that Brother Anselm has been troubled since finding the body. He takes his duties very seriously, and the fact that the bell was silenced, that he didn't notice anything wrong until it was too late, it weighs on him." "As well it might," Holmes said softly. "Very well. Let us begin with the library. I want to see what Brother Clement was working on when he died." They left the church through the main door, emerging into the cloister, where rain now fell steadily into the garden, darkening the stone paths and filling the air with the smell of wet earth and ancient walls. Monks hurried past with hoods raised, going about their duties despite the weather, their silence maintained even in the rain. Watson pulled his coat closer, feeling the chill of the place settle into his bones. Somewhere in this holy ground, someone walked who had committed murder with patience and precision. Someone who understood that silence could be both sanctuary and weapon. And Holmes, he knew, would not rest until that silence was broken. The library occupied the eastern wing of the Abbey, a long stone building whose windows faced the morning sun, or would have, had the morning offered anything but grey cloud and steady rain. Brother Timothy led them along a covered walkway, their footsteps echoing beneath the vaulted ceiling while water cascaded from the gargoyles above, ancient stone mouths spewing rain into carefully positioned drains that had channeled water for centuries. Holmes walked with his usual purposeful stride, seemingly oblivious to the cold that made Watson pull his coat tighter. Lestrade followed behind, his notebook protected beneath his coat, his expression showing the particular weariness of a man who had already spent 2 days pursuing questions that yielded only more questions. The library door was oak, thick as a man's forearm, and bound with iron straps that had oxidized to a deep brown black. Brother Timothy knocked, a curious formality, Watson thought, in a place where all belonged to the community, and waited for a response before entering. The warmth struck them immediately. Unlike the rest of the Abbey with its stone chill, the library was heated by a substantial fireplace at the far end, its flames carefully tended to provide warmth without excessive smoke that might damage the books. And there were books everywhere, lining the walls from floor to ceiling, stacked on reading tables, arranged in careful piles on a sorting desk near the fire. But it was not merely the quantity that impressed. It was the quality of care, evident in every detail. The shelves were built to precise heights, allowing air circulation. The windows were positioned to provide light without direct sunlight, that might fade bindings. The floor was swept clean, and the smell, that particular perfume of old paper, leather, vellum, and beeswax, spoke of disciplined preservation spanning generations. A monk rose from a reading desk as they entered, marking his place with a silk ribbon before closing the massive volume before him. He was perhaps 70, with the stooped shoulders of a man who had spent decades bent over manuscripts, and eyes that showed the slight cloudiness of age but still possessed remarkable clarity. "Brother Timothy," he said, his voice surprisingly strong. "And the gentleman from London, I presume?" "Brother Aldhelm, our librarian," Brother Timothy introduced. "He oversees our collection and works with those brothers engaged in scholarly pursuits. Brother Aldhelm, this is Mr. Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Watson, and you've already met Inspector Lestrade." Brother Aldhelm inclined his head. "You wish to know about Brother Clement's work. I've been expecting this inquiry." Holmes stepped forward, his eyes already scanning the room, cataloguing, assessing. Brother Clement worked here regularly. Every afternoon from after sext until vespers, he had a gift for languages, Latin, Greek, some Hebrew, and was helping me catalogue our older manuscripts. Many have never been properly documented. Brother Aldhelm gestured toward the shelves. "We have materials here dating back to the Abbey's founding in the 11th century. Some even older, manuscripts brought by monks fleeing Viking raids in the north." "What specifically was Brother Clement working on when he died?" The old librarian moved to a table near one of the windows, where several volumes lay open, held in place by leather-covered weights. He had been examining our collection of property documents and genealogical records. Not typical devotional material, but important for understanding the Abbey's history and holdings. Holmes approached the table, his hands clasped behind his back as he examined the documents without touching them. Watson joined him, peering at the pages covered in medieval Latin script. The letters formed with the painstaking precision of monks who had treated writing itself as a form of prayer. "Property documents," Holmes said thoughtfully. "From what period?" "Primarily the 13th and 14th centuries, though some date to the dissolution." Brother Aldhelm's voice took on a note of sadness. "When Henry VIII broke with Rome, many monasteries were stripped of their holdings. St. Cuthbert survived, but not without losses. Brother Clement was particularly interested in understanding what had been taken and under what pretenses." Lestrade moved closer, his policeman's instincts clearly aroused. Why would a monk care about property lost 400 years ago? "Historical interest, Inspector. Or, so I assumed." Brother Aldhelm touched one of the documents gently, reverently. But in recent weeks, Brother Clement's focus had narrowed considerably. He kept returning to records concerning a specific parcel of land, approximately 40 acres on the valley's southern slope. It was granted to the Abbey in 1147 by a Norman lord, but its ownership history before that grant was complicated. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Complicated how? The land had belonged to a Saxon family before the conquest. After 1066, it passed through several Norman hands, each claiming some form of right through marriage or service to the crown. By the time it came to the Abbey, the documentation of those transfers was remarkably vague. Brother Clement believed. The old monk paused, choosing his words carefully. He believed that if one could trace the original Saxon ownership, and if one could prove that the subsequent transfers were legally questionable, there might be grounds to challenge the Abbey's current claim. A profound silence followed this statement. Outside, the rain continued its steady percussion against the windows. Inside, the fire crackled softly, sending shadows dancing across the ancient texts. "Challenge the Abbey's claim," Holmes repeated softly. "In favour of whom?" "That," Brother Aldhelm said, "was precisely what I asked Brother Clement. He was evasive, said he was simply pursuing historical truth, that understanding how property had changed hands over centuries was important for its own sake. But I've been a librarian for 40 years, Mr. Holmes. I know the difference between scholarly curiosity and personal urgency. Brother Clement had found something that mattered to him deeply, though he would not say what. Watson felt the pieces shifting in his mind, patterns forming. If someone could prove they were descended from the original Saxon owners, and if they could prove the subsequent transfers were invalid, they would have a legal claim to 40 acres of prime farmland, Lestrade finished. Land that currently belongs to the Abbey, but might be worth a considerable sum to a secular owner. Holmes moved along the table, examining each document in turn, his eyes moving rapidly over the Latin text. "Brother Aldhelm, you said Brother Clement was a convert. What do you know of his life before he joined the Abbey?" "Very little. He came from somewhere in the Midlands, I believe. Minor gentry, perhaps, or upper merchant class. He had received a good education. His Latin was excellent, his knowledge of law surprisingly comprehensive. But he never spoke of his previous life, and we did not press him. Many who take holy orders are fleeing something: grief, failure, sins they wish to atone for. We respect that silence." "Did he receive correspondence from outside the Abbey?" Brother Aldhelm's brow furrowed. "Occasionally. Letters were delivered to the abbot's office and distributed after prime. I cannot say whether Brother Clement received any, though I believe he did, perhaps 2 or 3 times a year." "And in the weeks before his death? Any letters, then?" I'm not certain. You would need to ask Brother Anselm. He collects the post from the village." Holmes straightened, his expression thoughtful. "Brother Aldhelm, I need you to think very carefully. In the days before his death, did Brother Clement seem worried? Excited? Did he mention finding anything particular in his research?" The old monk was quiet for a long moment, his clouded eyes distant with memory. "3 days before he died, he came to me with a question about inheritance law. Specifically, he wanted to know whether a person could renounce a claim to property they had not yet formally established as theirs. It was an odd question, very specific. I told him that generally one cannot renounce what one does not possess, but that if one discovered they were the rightful heir to property, they could refuse to pursue the claim. He seemed relieved by that answer." "Relieved?" Holmes murmured. "Not disappointed?" "No, definitely relieved, as though I had confirmed something he hoped was true." Watson exchanged glances with Lestrade. The inspector's expression showed he was following the same line of reasoning. Brother Clement had discovered something about inheritance, something that potentially involved him personally, and his last thoughts had been about renouncing rather than claiming that inheritance. Holmes moved to the fireplace, standing with his back to the flames, his hawk-like profile illuminated against the shadows. "Let us suppose," he said slowly, "that Brother Clement discovered he had a legitimate claim to property, not the Abbey's land, perhaps, but land connected to it, through old transfers and complex genealogy. A claim that, if pursued, would bring him wealth and position in the secular world, but would also require him to leave the Abbey and his vows behind. A test of faith, Watson said quietly. Precisely. A test that Brother Clement, by all accounts, seemed prepared to pass by choosing his vows over worldly gain. Holmes turned to face them. But what if someone else knew about this discovery? Someone who also had a stake in how that land question was resolved? Brother Aldhelm's face had grown pale. You're suggesting that Brother Clement was killed because of what he found in these documents? I'm suggesting, Holmes said carefully, that knowledge can be dangerous, especially knowledge about property and inheritance. Brother Timothy, you mentioned that Brother Anselm is the sacristan. He oversees the bells and handles various administrative duties. Does he also have access to this library? All the brothers have access, Mr. Holmes. We encourage learning and contemplation. And Brother Anselm's family? Do you know anything of his background before joining the Abbey? Brother Timothy and Brother Aldhelm exchanged glances. It was the librarian who spoke. Brother Anselm has been with us for 15 years. He came from Norfolk, I believe, though he rarely speaks of his past. Like Brother Clement, he was a convert, rather than someone who grew up in religious life. Lestrade had his notebook out. Norfolk. That's not far from here. What, 50 miles? Approximately, Brother Aldhelm confirmed. Holmes's eyes had taken on the distant quality Watson recognized. His mind was racing through possibilities, connecting facts, building structures of logic that would either stand or collapse under the weight of evidence. I need to see the specific documents Brother Clement was examining, the ones concerning that 40-acre parcel. Brother Aldhelm hesitated. Mr. Holmes, these are Abbey property, some quite fragile. I cannot simply— A man has been murdered, Holmes said, his voice gentle but firm. Whatever secrets these documents contain, they're worth less than a human life. Show me what Brother Clement found, and I give you my word that I will handle them with the care they deserve. The old librarian regarded him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Very well, but you must wear gloves, and you must work here, at this table, where I can supervise. Agreed. Brother Aldhelm moved to a cabinet, unlocked it with a key from his robes, and withdrew a wooden box perhaps 18 inches long. He carried it to the table, with the reverence one might show a reliquary, and opened it to reveal a collection of documents, some on vellum, some on paper, all showing the brown stains of considerable age. These are the transfers Brother Clement was studying. The original Saxon charter is here. He indicated a piece of vellum covered in angular script, granting the land to a family called Elfweird. Then successive transfers through Norman hands, to Raoul de Mortain, then to Hugh Devereux, then to the Fitz-Alan family, and finally to the Abbey in 1147. Holmes, now wearing the cotton gloves Brother Aldhelm provided, examined each document with intense concentration. Watson watched his friend's eyes move across the medieval script, his lips occasionally moving as he translated the Latin. After perhaps 20 minutes, Holmes straightened. "The Fitz-Alan transfer," he said. "It's irregular." "How so?" Lestrade asked. "The document purports to be a grant from William Fitz-Alan to the Abbey, executed in 1147. But the seal impression doesn't match other known Fitz-Alan seals from that period, and the witness list includes 2 names that appear nowhere else in contemporary records. Either this is a forgery created at the time, or it was created later, Brother Aldhelm finished, his voice barely a whisper, to legitimize a seizure that had no legal basis, which would mean the Abbey's current ownership might indeed be questionable, Watson said. Holmes carefully returned the documents to their box. Brother Aldhelm, if the Fitzalan transfer is invalid, to whom would the property revert? That would depend on the last legitimate owner. If we accept all the transfers up to Fitzalan as valid, then the property should have remained with the Fitzalan heirs. But if earlier transfers were also problematic. The old monk spread his hands, helplessly. You would need genealogical records to trace the modern descendants. Which Brother Clement was examining, Holmes said. Do you have such records here? Some. Family histories, parish records copied for preservation. Much was lost during the dissolution, but what survived is here. He moved to another section of shelves, running his finger along the spines. Here, Devereux family history, and here, genealogies compiled in the 17th century tracing various county families. Holmes took down the volumes, opening them with careful hands. For the next hour, while rain continued outside and the fire burned low and was built up again, he read with absolute focus, occasionally making notes on paper Brother Aldhelm provided. Watson and Lestrade waited, the inspector pacing quietly while Watson sat by the fire, watching the shadows shift across the ancient stones. Finally, Holmes closed the last volume and removed his gloves. His expression was grave. Gentlemen, said quietly, I believe I understand why Brother Clement died, and I believe I know who killed him. The rain had softened to a persistent drizzle by the time they left the library, the kind of November weather that seemed neither to begin nor end, but simply to exist, turning the world grey and damp and patient. Holmes walked in silence, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes distant with thought. Watson knew better than to press him when he wore this expression. The evidence was gathered, the pieces were arranging themselves, but the final pattern had not yet crystallized into certainty. Brother Timothy led them back across the cloister, but instead of returning to the guest quarters, Holmes stopped abruptly at the entrance to the herb garden. Brother Timothy, he said, I need to speak with Brother Osric, the novice who tends the bees. The monk's eyebrows rose slightly. Brother Osric, may I ask why? Because he is young, and the young notice things that their elders have learned to ignore. Also because he works with wax, and wax is at the heart of this matter. Holmes tilted his head, listening. Is that him I hear? Someone is working in the garden, despite the rain. Brother Timothy listened, then nodded. Yes, Brother Osric takes his duties very seriously, perhaps too seriously. He worries the plants will suffer if he misses a day's care, even in winter, when most lie dormant. They found the young novice in a corner of the herb garden, carefully cutting back the dead growth from what appeared to be lavender bushes, his hood pulled up against the drizzle, but his movements unhurried, methodical. He was perhaps 19 or 20, with the kind of face that would have been called delicate had it belonged to a woman, fine-boned, with large dark eyes that held a permanent expression of slight worry. He looked up as they approached, and Watson saw the immediate flash of fear cross his features before he mastered it, and rose, brushing dirt from his robes. Brother Osric, Brother Timothy said gently, these gentlemen wish to speak with you about Brother Clement. The young man's hands, Watson noted, began to tremble slightly. He clasped them together, but not before Holmes had observed the gesture. "There's no need for concern," Holmes said, his voice deliberately soft, almost fatherly, a tone Watson had rarely heard him use. "You're not in any trouble, but I believe you may have seen something that could help us understand what happened. Will you walk with me?" Brother Osric glanced at Brother Timothy, who nodded encouragement. "Yes, Mr. Holmes. Of course." Holmes gestured toward a covered walkway that bordered the garden, protected from the rain by a wooden roof supported on stone pillars. They walked slowly, Holmes maintaining a careful distance that was neither threatening nor too familiar, his hands still clasped behind his back. "You tend the bees," Holmes began, not as a question, but as an observation. "Yes, sir. We keep 3 hives beyond the kitchen garden. They provide honey for the infirmary and wax for candles. It's important work." The young man's voice was soft, educated, another convert, Watson guessed, from a family of some standing. "And lonely work, I imagine. Bees are not terribly conversational." A ghost of a smile touched Brother Osric's lips. "No, sir, but I find the solitude peaceful. Or I did, before Brother Clement died." The smile vanished. "Yes." Holmes stopped walking, turning to face the young novice directly. "Brother Osric, I need you to understand something. A man has been murdered within these walls, murdered with considerable planning and premeditation. The person who did this relied on the silence of this community, both the literal silence of your rule and the figurative silence of people who are afraid to speak what they've seen. That silence protects a killer." Brother Osric's face had gone pale. I don't know anything about the murder. Perhaps not about the murder itself, but you saw something, didn't you? Something that seemed insignificant at the time, or something you were afraid to mention because you yourself had broken a rule. Holmes's voice remained gentle, but his eyes were intent. "I'm not here to enforce monastic discipline, Brother Osric. I'm here to find the truth about how Brother Clement died, and I believe you can help me do that." The young man stood frozen, conflict written plainly across his features. Watson could see the internal struggle, duty to the community versus whatever knowledge he possessed, fear of confession versus fear of the consequences of continued silence. Brother Osric's voice cracked slightly. "I was reading, after Compline, after the great silence had begun." "Reading what?" Holmes asked, without judgment. "Poetry. Secular poetry, Chaucer. It's not forbidden exactly, but it's discouraged after Compline. We're meant to use the night hours for sleep and prayer, not for—" He trailed off miserably. "Not for pleasure reading," Holmes finished. "Go on. You were reading in your cell." "No. My cell is small and dark, and I didn't want to waste candle. There's a window alcove in the corridor outside the dormitory where moonlight comes through. I often go there when I can't sleep, when the silence feels too heavy." He looked up at Holmes, almost pleadingly. "Is that very wrong?" "It's very human," Holmes said quietly. "And what did you see from this window alcove?" Brother Osric took a shaky breath. "A figure, walking through the cloister toward the church. It was perhaps an hour after Compline. I heard the clock in the village strike 10. The figure was carrying something, a wooden pail, I think, the kind we use for cleaning." Holmes's entire body had gone still with attention. "You're certain it was a pail?" "Yes, sir. I could see the shape of it, the way they carried it with one hand, careful not to spill anything. Could you identify who it was? No. Brother Osric shook his head miserably. They wore their hood up, and it was dark, just moonlight. I could tell they were one of us, the robes, the way they walked, but not who specifically. Tall? Short? Young? Old? The young novice thought carefully. Not young. The movements were, I don't know how to describe it, not the quickness of youth, deliberate, measured, someone older but not elderly, strong enough to carry a full pail without difficulty. And where did this figure go? Toward the church. I watched until they passed out of sight behind the chapel wall. I assumed someone had been given special permission for some task. It didn't seem my place to question it. Holmes nodded slowly. And you didn't report this because I shouldn't have been there to see it, because I'd broken the great silence for my own selfish purposes. I thought... Brother Osric's voice dropped to a whisper. I thought if I mentioned what I'd seen, would be confessing my own disobedience. And for what? Someone carrying a pail. It seemed so ordinary. Until Brother Clement was found dead, Watson said gently. The young man's eyes filled with tears. Yes, and then I was afraid. Afraid that what I'd seen mattered, but afraid to speak because I'd waited too long, because my silence had already made me complicit in something terrible. Holmes reached out and placed a hand on Brother Osric's shoulder, a gesture of surprising gentleness. You're not complicit. You're a young man caught between rules you're trying to honor and knowledge you're afraid to share. But you've shared it now, and that took courage. Will you tell the abbot about my reading? I will tell the abbot only what is necessary to solve this case. Your poetry reading, I think, can remain between us. Holmes withdrew his hand and resumed his pacing along the covered walk. Brother Osric, think carefully. This pail, would it have been large enough to carry water and wax? Enough wax to coat a bell clapper? The novice's eyes widened as understanding dawned. You think someone used our wax to silence the bell? I know someone did. The evidence is unmistakable. The question is, who had access to sufficient wax, who knew how to apply it, and who had reason to want the bell silenced that night? Anyone could access the wax stores, Brother Osric said slowly. They're kept in the workroom, and the workroom is unlocked during the day. We all use candles, so we all take wax as needed. But to know how to apply it to silence a bell, that would require understanding of how bells work. Who has such understanding? Brother Anselm, certainly. As sacristan, he maintains the bells. And Brother Aldhelm, our librarian. He's written about the tower's history and the bell's construction. Perhaps a few of the older brothers who've served here for decades. But most of us simply ring them when told. We don't think about their mechanisms. Lestrade, who had been listening intently, spoke up. Brother Osric, did you notice anything else unusual in the days before Brother Clement died? Anything at all, even if it seemed meaningless? The young novice frowned, thinking. Brother Clement had seemed distracted. During our communal prayers, his mind appeared to be elsewhere, and I saw him once, late afternoon, in the library with Brother Anselm. They were speaking quietly, but I had the impression it wasn't a pleasant conversation. Brother Clement's face was flushed, and Brother Anselm looked stern. When was this? Holmes asked sharply. 2 days before Brother Clement died. I remember because I was supposed to deliver fresh candles to the library, and I hesitated at the door, because they seemed so intent on their conversation. Brother Aldhelm noticed me and gestured for me to leave the candles by the door rather than interrupt. Holmes and Lestrade exchanged significant glances. Watson could see the pattern forming more clearly. Now, Brother Clement's research into property records, his questions about renouncing inheritance, his tense conversation with Brother Anselm, and then his death in a bell tower that had been deliberately silenced. "Brother Osric," Holmes said, "this conversation you overheard. Could you make out any words?" "No, sir. They were speaking too quietly. But Brother Anselm said something at the end, as I was leaving. I heard him clearly because he raised his voice slightly. He said, 'Some questions are better left unasked.'" Holmes stopped walking so abruptly that Watson nearly collided with him. "Some questions are better left unasked," he repeated softly. "Those exact words?" "Yes, sir, I'm certain." "And Brother Clement's response?" "I didn't hear one. I was already leaving." Holmes stood very still for a moment, his hawk-like profile sharp against the grey afternoon light filtering through the drizzle. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, but carried an edge of certainty. "Brother Osric, you've been tremendously helpful. What you've told me confirms several theories and eliminates others. I need you to do one more thing for me. Say nothing of this conversation to anyone except Brother Timothy and the abbot. Can you do that?" "Yes, Mr. Holmes. But do you know who killed Brother Clement?" "I believe I do. But knowing and proving are different matters, and I must be absolutely certain before I make an accusation. In a place like this, built on trust and brotherhood, a false accusation would be nearly as damaging as the murder itself." Brother Osric nodded, though he looked troubled. Will you tell us soon?" "The not knowing is terrible. We look at each other and wonder, and that wondering poisons everything." "I will tell you as soon as I can do so with certainty," Holmes promised. "Thank you for your courage in speaking with me." The young novice bowed slightly and turned back toward the herb garden, his shoulders hunched against the rain. That had begun to strengthen again. They watched him go, this young man carrying the weight of knowledge he hadn't wanted and guilt he didn't deserve. "Poor lad," Watson said quietly. "Indeed." Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, I need you to verify something with Brother Anselm. Don't confront him directly, but find out where he was between Compline and Matins on the night of the murder. His exact movements, if possible." "You think he's our killer?" "I think the evidence points in a very specific direction, but I need more before I'm willing to stake my reputation on it. There's one more piece missing, the motive. We know about the property dispute. We know Brother Clement had discovered something about inheritance. And we know he had a conversation with Brother Anselm that ended with a warning about unasked questions. But what we don't know is why Brother Anselm would commit murder to keep those questions unanswered." "Perhaps," Watson suggested, "he has a stake in the property himself." "That's my working theory, yes, but I need confirmation." Holmes looked toward the library, its windows glowing warmly against the grey afternoon. "Brother Aldhelm has genealogical records. It's time to discover whether Brother Anselm's family name appears in any of them, and if so, in what context." They began walking back toward the library, the rain now falling steadily enough that they moved quickly, their breath visible in the cold air. Watson felt the familiar tightening in his chest that always accompanied the final stages of one of Holmes's investigations, the sense that all the scattered pieces were drawing together, that the pattern was becoming visible, that truth was emerging from shadow. But he also felt something else, sadness for this quiet place that had been violated, for the young novice carrying unnecessary guilt, for the old librarian whose precious documents had become evidence of murder, and most of all for Brother Clement, who had apparently discovered a truth that cost him his life. "Holmes," he said as they reached the library door, "even if we prove Brother Anselm killed him, will we ever really understand why? What drives a man to murder in a place dedicated to peace?" Holmes paused with his hand on the door, his expression unreadable. "The same things that drive men to murder anywhere, Watson. Fear, greed, the desperate conviction that one's own needs matter more than another's life. The only difference here is that those motivations must operate in a context of professed holiness, which makes them somehow more tragic." He pushed open the door, and they stepped back into the warmth of the library, where answers waited in documents written by dead men's hands, and where Brother Aldhelm looked up from his reading with eyes that already knew the questions they had come to ask. The fire in the library had been built up again, its flames casting dancing shadows across the spines of ancient volumes, while outside the rain continued its steady percussion against the windows. Brother Aldhelm sat at his reading desk, his hands folded atop a closed manuscript, his expression suggesting he had been waiting for their return, with the resignation of one who knows that difficult truths can be delayed but not avoided. "You wish to know about Brother Anselm's family," he said without preamble, as Holmes, Watson, and Lestrade entered. It was not a question. Holmes paused in the act of removing his damp coat. "You've anticipated me. I'm old, Mr. Holmes, but not blind. When you asked to see the genealogical records, when you inquired about Brother Anselm's background, the connections were not difficult to make." The old librarian rose slowly, moving with the careful precision of aged joints in cold weather. "I've had 2 hours while you were gone to consider what I know, and what I should have noticed long ago." He crossed to the shelves where the family histories were kept, running his finger along the spines until he found what he sought. The Anselm family, originally styled Anselm de Norwood, were minor gentry in Norfolk, their lands granted after the conquest. Not wealthy, not powerful, but respectable. Their line can be traced clearly through parish records and property transfers until approximately 1780, when the male line appears to have died out. "Appears to have," Holmes repeated, catching the significant word. Brother Aldhelm opened the volume, its pages crackling with age. The last recorded heir was Richard Anselm, who died without legitimate issue in 1778. The property, a small manor house and perhaps 60 acres, passed to a cousin through the female line, someone with a different surname. But he paused, his finger tracing a handwritten note in the margin. There were persistent local rumours of an illegitimate son, born to Richard Anselm and a housemaid. The child was supposedly sent away to be raised by relatives. Given the mother's surname, the connection never formally acknowledged. Watson leaned closer, reading the cramped notation. Did this child have any legal claim? Not unless legitimized, which apparently never occurred. The child would have been considered baseborn, with no rights to the property or name. Brother Aldhelm turned pages, stopping at a family tree drawn in brown ink. But here's what interests me. The cousin who inherited sold the property within 5 years. It was broken up, parcelled out to various buyers. The main house fell into disrepair and was eventually demolished. The Anselm name effectively vanished from Norfolk. Holmes had drawn closer, his eyes intent on the genealogical charts. And Brother Anselm, our Brother Anselm, comes from Norfolk, you said. So I understood, though he rarely speaks of his past. But Mr. Holmes, surely you're not suggesting that our Brother Anselm is descended from this illegitimate line? Even if he were, he would have no legal claim to property that was sold legitimately 2 centuries ago. No, Holmes agreed softly. But he might care very much about legitimacy itself, about the question of blood rights versus legal reality, about families torn apart by questions of inheritance and respectability. He turned to look at the documents concerning the 40-acre parcel still laid out on the work table. Brother Aldhelm, I need you to trace the Anselm family connection to this land, to the property Brother Clement was researching. Is there any link, however tenuous? The old librarian's face had grown troubled. He moved to the table, sorting through the documents with practiced efficiency despite his shaking hands. The Fitzalan transfer of 1147, which we discussed as being possibly fraudulent. The Fitzalan family held the land before it came to the Abbey. After the Abbey received it, the Fitzalan line continued for several generations. Then, he paused, reading intently. Then, the Fitzalan daughter married into the Mortain family. The Mortain holdings, eventually fragmented, passed through female lines, and his finger moved across a complex web of marriages and inheritances. Sweet mercy! A portion of the Mortain descendants married into the de Norwood family. The family that became simply Anselm, Holmes said. Yes, by the late 14th century there was an Anselm de Norwood who could claim descent, through multiple female lines, admittedly, from the original Fitzalan holders. If the Fitzalan transfer to the Abbey was indeed fraudulent, and if one were to argue that the land should revert to Fitzalan heirs, then... Brother Aldhelm's voice trailed off as the implications crystallized. Then a legitimate Anselm descendant might have a claim, Lestrade finished, his policeman's mind cutting through the genealogical complexity to the practical matter. Not a strong claim, perhaps, but one that could be argued in court, especially if the Abbey's own title documents proved questionable. Watson shook his head slowly. But Brother Anselm has taken holy orders. He's renounced worldly possessions. What good would such a claim do him? None, Holmes said, if he intended to remain Brother Anselm. But what if he didn't? What if he came to the Abbey specifically to access these records, to understand his family's history, and what he found troubled him? Consider. A man discovers he might be descended from a legitimate line that was cheated of its inheritance. He finds evidence that suggests the Abbey's ownership of valuable land might be legally questionable. He spent 15 years in this community, taken vows, built a life. And then Brother Clement, another scholar, another man researching the same documents, discovers the same truth. Holmes began pacing, his voice taking on the tone of reconstruction that Watson had heard countless times before. Brother Clement found the fraudulent Fitzalan transfer. He was troubled enough by it to ask Brother Aldhelm about renouncing inheritance, suggesting he, too, had discovered some personal connection to the land question. Perhaps his own family had been cheated, or perhaps he simply felt the moral weight of the Abbey holding property under false pretenses. Being a man of conscience, he would have wanted to make it right, which would mean revealing the truth, Lestrade said slowly, challenging the Abbey's claim. and potentially exposing Brother Anselm's own interest in the matter, Holmes continued. If Brother Clement went to Brother Anselm to discuss what he'd found, which the conversation Brother Osric witnessed suggests he did, then Brother Anselm would have been faced with a terrible choice. Allow the truth to emerge, possibly leading to legal challenges, public scrutiny, and the unravelling of everything he'd built in his monastic life. Or silence the question permanently, Watson finished, feeling sick. Brother Aldhelm had sunk into his chair, his face ashen. You're saying Brother Anselm killed Brother Clement to protect a potential inheritance claim? But that makes no sense. He would have to leave the abbey to pursue such a claim, and killing a brother monk would surely make him a murderer, yes, Holmes said gently. Which is why I don't believe the inheritance itself was the motive. I believe the motive was far more complex and far more tragic. He returned to the table, his hands resting on the documents that had set this whole terrible chain in motion. Brother Anselm came here, I think, genuinely seeking religious life. Perhaps he knew of his family's history and wanted to escape it, to find peace in renunciation rather than in pursuing a claim that might be legally questionable anyway. He spent 15 years building that peace. And then Brother Clement's research threatened to expose everything. Not just the land question, but Brother Anselm's own hidden history, his secret knowledge of potential claims, perhaps even raising questions about why he came to this abbey in the first place. You're suggesting he killed to protect his vocation? Watson asked quietly. Not to gain wealth, but to preserve his life here. I'm suggesting that when worldly concerns invade spiritual spaces, the resulting conflicts can be devastating. Brother Anselm had achieved something rare, genuine detachment from his family's past, genuine commitment to this community. And then that past emerged again, threatened to define him again, threatened to transform him from Brother Anselm into simply an Anselm descendant with a claim to pursue. He would have seen Brother Clement not as a fellow seeker after truth, but as a threat to everything he'd become. The rain against the windows seemed louder in the silence that followed. Brother Aldhelm sat with his head bowed, his old hands trembling. When he spoke, his voice was thick with grief. I should have seen it, the way Brother Anselm watched whenever Brother Clement worked here, the tension in him during those final weeks. I attributed it to the usual stresses of communal life, the small frictions that arise when people live in close quarters. I never imagined. You couldn't have known, Lestrade said, surprising Watson with his gentleness. Evil that wears the mask of piety is the hardest evil to detect. Holmes straightened, his expression resolving into decision. Inspector Lestrade, we need to speak with Brother Anselm. Not in accusation yet. I want to give him the opportunity to explain, to confess if his conscience moves him. But we need to confront him with what we know and see how he responds. And if he denies everything, Lestrade asked, then we present our evidence to the abbot and let ecclesiastical authority work in parallel with secular law. But I suspect, I hope, that Brother Anselm is still enough of the man who sought holy orders that his conscience will not permit him to compound murder with lies. Holmes turned to Brother Aldhelm. Where would we find Brother Anselm at? This hour? The old librarian consulted a mental schedule, his lips moving slightly. None. The mid-afternoon office will have just concluded. Brother Anselm typically spends the hour between none and vespers in the sacristy, tending to the altar cloths and preparing for evening prayer. You'll find him there, unless... He paused, his face troubled. "Unless what?" Holmes prompted. "Unless his conscience has already moved him to some desperate act. Mr. Holmes, if Brother Anselm believes himself discovered, if he sees no path forward—" Brother Aldhelm's meaning was clear. Holmes' face tightened. "Then we'd best not delay. Brother Timothy, would you take us to the sacristy?" Brother Timothy, who had been standing silently near the door throughout this entire exchange, nodded gravely. "This way. But Mr. Holmes, I should warn you. Brother Anselm is a strong man despite his years, and if he feels cornered—" "I've dealt with cornered men before," Holmes said quietly. "And Dr. Watson is no stranger to dangerous situations. Inspector Lestrade is armed, I trust." Lestrade patted his coat. "Always." They left the library, moving through corridors that seemed darker now, despite the hour being barely past 3 in the afternoon. The rain had thickened to a downpour, drumming against roof tiles and pouring from gargoyles in streams that looked like tears. Watson found himself thinking of Brother Clement, of his quiet scholarship and his troubled conscience, of the fact that seeking truth had led him to a bell tower in the dark. The sacristy was reached through a side door off the main church. Brother Timothy knocked softly, then tried the handle. The door swung open on well-oiled hinges, revealing a room lined with cupboards and chests, a work table in the centre, and windows looking out onto the rain-drenched cloister. Brother Anselm stood at the table, folding a white altar cloth with the precise, meditative movements of long practice. He looked up as they entered, and Watson saw in his face neither surprise nor fear, but something closer to relief, the expression of a man who has been waiting for an inevitable reckoning, and is almost grateful it has finally arrived. "Mr. Holmes," he said quietly, setting down the cloth, "I wondered how long it would take you. You're more efficient than I expected." "Brother Anselm," Holmes said, his voice carefully neutral, "we've been researching the documents Brother Clement was studying before his death. Documents concerning property transfers, genealogy, and questions of inheritance." "Ah." Brother Anselm nodded slowly. "Then you know." "I know that you have connections to one of the families involved in the disputed land transfers. I know that Brother Clement discovered irregularities that troubled him. I know that you and he had a conversation about questions better left unasked." Holmes moved closer, his eyes never leaving Brother Anselm's face. "What I don't know is what happened in the bell tower that night. I don't know whether Brother Clement's death was murder or something else. And I don't know whether the man standing before me is a killer or simply a man caught in impossible circumstances." Brother Anselm was silent for a long moment, his hands resting on the altar cloth, his face working with some internal struggle. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to kill him. You must believe that. I only meant to explain, to ask him to stay silent, to let the past remain buried. But he wouldn't listen. He said truth mattered more than peace, that justice required action, even when action brought pain. We argued. I was holding the bell rope, showing him how I'd silence the bell with wax, trying to demonstrate that I'd only wanted to speak with him privately, without alerting the whole community. And he tried to leave, tried to go to the abbot immediately. I grabbed him, just meaning to stop him, to make him listen. But we struggled, and the rope was around his neck somehow, and I pulled, and—" His voice broke. Tears streamed down his face, dripping onto the white cloth beneath his hands. God forgive me. I pulled, and he fell, and when I checked his pulse, there was nothing. Nothing. I had killed him. Killed the kindest man in this community, killed him for wanting to do the right thing, killed him because I was too proud, too frightened to let my past define me again. The confession hung in the air like incense, heavy and undeniable. Lestrade stepped forward, his hand moving to the handcuffs at his belt. Brother Anselm, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Brother Clement. You'll need to come with me. But Brother Anselm shook his head slowly. No, Inspector. I won't resist. I promise you that. But allow me first to confess to the abbot, to receive whatever spiritual counsel he can offer. I've broken my vows in the worst possible way. I need to answer to God before I answer to man's law. Holmes looked at Lestrade, and something passed between them, an understanding that in this place, in these circumstances, spiritual authority deserved its moment before secular justice took its course. The abbot, Lestrade said finally, but I stay with you, and Dr. Watson and Mr. Holmes as witnesses. Of course, Brother Anselm whispered. I only ask that the bells be allowed to ring properly again, that whatever happens to me, this community not suffer for my sins. The silence has been terrible. Let the bells speak truth again. And so they walked through the rain-soaked cloister to find the abbot, a small procession carrying the weight of murder and confession, while above them the bells hung silent in their tower, waiting to be restored to their proper voice. The abbot's face, when Brother Anselm made his confession, showed neither shock nor anger, but a profound sorrow that seemed to age him a decade in moments. He listened in silence as Brother Anselm spoke, haltingly, through tears, but with the thoroughness of a man determined to omit no detail, to hide behind no excuse. When the confession was complete, the abbot bowed his head for a long moment, his lips moving in what Watson assumed was prayer. You will be taken into secular custody, the abbot said finally, his voice steady despite the grief evident in every line of his face. The law must have its due, but you remain, until that moment, a brother of this community, and I will not abandon you to despair. Brother Timothy, fetch Father Benedict from the village. Brother Anselm will need a confessor who is not so personally affected by this tragedy. Brother Anselm nodded, unable to speak. Lestrade, to his credit, waited quietly while the abbot made arrangements, showing a respect for the abbey's internal procedures that Watson found deeply decent. It was decided that Brother Anselm would be held in one of the guest cells until the local magistrate could be summoned in the morning. Lestrade would maintain watch, though no one seriously believed Brother Anselm would attempt to flee. The man seemed instead to have collapsed inward, all the tension that had sustained him through 15 years of hidden knowledge and 3 days of terrible secret-keeping finally released, leaving only exhaustion and grief. As they prepared to transfer Brother Anselm to his temporary confinement, Holmes spoke quietly to the abbot. Father Abbot, the bell tower. Brother Anselm's last request was that the bells ring properly again. With your permission, I'd like to clean the wax from the clapper before evening prayer. The abbot's eyes held gratitude. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. Yes. The silence has been difficult for all of us. Brother Timothy will provide whatever you need. The rain had finally ceased by the time Holmes and Watson climbed the spiral stairs once more, carrying rags and a small pot of warm water Brother Timothy had provided. The bell chamber was dim in the late afternoon light, the bronze surfaces of the bells gleaming dully. Holmes worked in silence, carefully cleaning the wax deposits from the great bell's clapper, his movements precise and respectful. Watson helped where he could, though mostly he simply stood witness, thinking about the complexity of what had transpired here. He was telling the truth, wasn't he? Watson said after a while. About not meaning to kill Brother Clement. Holmes paused in his work, considering. I believe he was. The physical evidence supports his account. The abraded rope, the position of the body, the wax applied before, rather than after, the struggle. He planned to have a private conversation, not to commit murder. But intention and outcome are not the same thing, and the law will judge the outcome. It's tragic. He'd built a genuine life here, 15 years of service, of devotion, and it all collapsed because he couldn't let go of a past that hadn't even given him anything tangible. The past rarely needs to give us tangible things to maintain its grip on us, Holmes said quietly. Brother Anselm couldn't bear the thought of being reduced once again to the illegitimate descendant with a questionable claim. He'd escaped that identity by becoming Brother Anselm the sacristan, the man who rang the bells and tended the sacred spaces. When Brother Clement's research threatened to drag him back into genealogical disputes and inheritance questions, he panicked. And panic, Watson, makes people capable of terrible things. Holmes finished cleaning the clapper and stepped back, examining his work. There, the bell should sound properly now. They descended the stairs together, emerging into a church that was beginning to fill with monks gathering for vespers. The community moved with their usual quiet grace. But Watson could sense the underlying tension, the whispered questions about why Brother Anselm was not in his usual place, why strangers had been closeted with the abbot for over an hour. The abbot would tell them soon, Watson knew, would explain as much as was necessary, would guide them through their grief and confusion. It was, after all, what abbots did. Shepherd their flocks through darkness as well as light. Brother Timothy appeared at Holmes's elbow. The abbot asks if you would stay for vespers. He says the bells should be rung by someone who understands what they mean now. Not just their spiritual purpose, but the price that was paid for their silence. Holmes looked surprised, then slowly nodded. I would be honoured. And so, as the November twilight deepened outside the ancient windows, Sherlock Holmes, consulting detective, man of science, self-proclaimed reasoner, stood in a medieval church and pulled the rope that rang the bells for evening prayer. The sound was magnificent, pure and clear and true, rolling out across the abbey grounds and down into the valley beyond, calling the faithful to worship as bells had called them for centuries. Watson watched his friend's face as he rang, saw something there he had rarely witnessed. A kind of peace, perhaps, or recognition that some mysteries were meant to be solved not for personal glory, but to restore what had been broken. The monks sang their office, their voices rising and falling in the ancient cadences of plainchant. Watson, standing at the back of the church, felt the weight of the past few days begin to lift. Brother Clement's death could not be undone, and Brother Anselm's fate would be decided by courts, both ecclesiastical and secular. But the abbey itself would survive. It had survived Viking raids and Norman conquest, Reformation and dissolution, war and plague. It would survive this too. After the service, as the monks filed out in their customary silence, though Watson thought he detected a lighter quality to that silence now, as though a poison had been drawn. The abbot approached them. "You've given us back our voice," he said simply. "The bells ring true again, and we can begin to heal. Thank you, Mr. Holmes, and you, Dr. Watson, and you, Inspector Lestrade." "Will the community recover?" Watson asked. "In time. We're practiced in the art of bearing wounds and finding grace within them. Brother Clement will be remembered with honour, and will pray for Brother Anselm's soul, whatever becomes of him in this world." The abbot's smile was sad, but genuine. Even in a place dedicated to peace, human frailty finds its way in. We're reminded that vows don't make us perfect, only committed to trying. The train back to London departed late that evening. Holmes, Watson, and Lestrade sat in a compartment as the countryside rolled past, invisible now in the darkness, but present in the rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails. "Well," Lestrade said finally, breaking the long silence, "I couldn't have solved it without you, Holmes. The genealogy, the property claims, the psychology of it all, it was beyond standard police work." "You would have gotten there," Holmes said, though they all knew it was a generous fiction. "You had noticed the wax and the metal filings. The rest was merely connecting threads that were already visible. Still, I'm grateful." They fell silent again, each lost in his own thoughts. Watson found himself thinking about the Abbey as they'd left it. Lights glowing in windows, bells ringing the hours, life continuing in its ancient patterns, despite the violence that had briefly shattered its peace. "Holmes," he said eventually, "will you write this case up for your records?" "No," Holmes said quietly. "This one is for you, Watson, if you choose to write it at all. It's more your sort of story than mine, about conscience and community, about the weight of the past and the price of secrets. I merely provided the logical framework." "And what did you learn from it?" Holmes was silent for a long moment, watching the darkness beyond the window. That silence can be both sanctuary and prison, that the past is never as buried as we wish it to be, and that even in the most spiritual of places, human beings remain remarkably, tragically human. It was near midnight when they finally reached Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson had kept the fire burning in anticipation of their return, and the familiar clutter of 221B seemed almost absurdly comforting after the Abbey's austere stone. Holmes settled into his chair with a sigh, reaching for his pipe. Watson took his customary seat opposite, feeling exhaustion finally settle into his bones. "The bells," Watson said after a while. "They're ringing properly now, not as prophecy, not as warning, just as bells, marking the hours as they should." "Yes," Holmes agreed, lighting his pipe. "Truth restored. It's not justice, perhaps. Brother Clement is still dead, and Brother Anselm's life is ruined. But it's something. The Abbey can move forward with honesty rather than superstition." Through the window, London's own bells began to sound midnight. Church bells and clock towers, the great voice of the city marking time as it had for centuries. Different from the Abbey's bells, more cacophonous, less harmonious, but serving the same essential purpose, calling people to remembrance, to attention, to the recognition that time passes and must be marked and honoured. Watson thought of the monks sleeping now in their cells, of Brother Anselm lying awake in his confinement, of the abbot perhaps standing at a window and listening to the bells that once again spoke truth. He thought of Brother Clement, buried now in the Abbey's small cemetery, his research complete in a way he never intended, his questions answered with terrible finality. "Sleep well, old friend," Holmes said quietly, as though reading his thoughts. "It's over. The Abbey of Silent Bells has its voice restored, and we can rest knowing we've left it more honest than we found it." Watson nodded, rising to make his way to his room. At the door, he paused and looked back. Holmes sat, wreathed in pipe smoke, his eyes already distant, perhaps already turning to the next problem, the next puzzle. But, for this moment, in the firelight and the quiet of their familiar rooms, there was peace. "Good night, Holmes. Good night, Watson." And so we leave the Abbey of Silent Bells to its rhythms, bells ringing true, monks at prayer, the great wheel of hours turning as it always has. Truth restored, silence broken only by the proper sounds of devotion. The mystery solved not with triumph, but with the quiet satisfaction of bringing light to shadow, of ensuring that even in death, Brother Clement's quest for honesty was honored. Until the next mystery calls, sleep well, dear listener, sleep well.